Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Full Quota Podcast. It's just going to be me today. Paul is struggling in Zim with the connections for the in his time with the World Cup qualifiers. Today, I have a very special guest because we have the Netherlands series happening on Friday, which is beginning on Friday. We have Bertus de Jong, who is situated in Netherlands, and whenever you see him on social media, he's always talking positively about all things Netherlands. Welcome, Bertus.
Hi, Tim. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for coming on. Okay, so let's get straight into it. Let's get into the bad bit. What went on in the T20 World Cup? We had Stefan Meiberg earlier in the week coming on, and he was talking about it. But from your perspective, what went on there? What? Because there was a lot of hope leading into the tournament for the Netherlands.
Well, yeah, I mean, on paper, the Dutch coming into the tournament, they won the qualifier, so and they'd won the qualifier in the UAE. So on paper, you'd have backed them to do pretty well. But the warning signs were there before the tournament started, and a few people flagged them, myself included. And I'm sure that Steph would have mentioned that the preparation was less than ideal. The Dutch do struggle to get fixtures at the best of times, and when they do, often they don't get to play with a full strength team. Because a lot of the guys are based in the UK, like it's sort of a bit of a double-edged sword that Dutch players were at least still qualified to play as locals in county cricket. It means a lot of the guys, play professionally in the UK, but it means they struggle to play together as a team, which makes the kind of lead into these tournaments all the more important. And whereas a lot of the other teams in the first round managed to put together pretty comprehensive warm-up schedules in addition to what the ICC provide, those two warm-ups. The Dutch, they really struggled to get games together. And for a team that doesn't play together as often as they'd like, I think a lot of people were worried that they looked undercooked going into the tournament, and that they'd struggled to adjust, not just to adjust their game plans and to gel as a team again, having had like this long layoff, partly because of COVID and partly just because fixtures are always a struggle for a team like the Netherlands. But yeah, to adjust to conditions as well, which didn't necessarily suit their game plans in the way that they might have hoped. And then having the Ireland game first up, which really was, I mean, people looking at that ahead, that's a must-win game for both teams, and they did just look underprepared. They batted first, which I mean, with the benefit of hindsight, didn't look like a good plan in this tournament. Though a lot of people were flagging that as well in advance of a thing that the Dutch tend to like to do, which probably wasn't necessarily appropriate in the conditions. I mean, it's not so much what went wrong; it's a struggle to think of what went right.
Yeah, Steph brought up exactly the same issues that you just spoke about. He said preparation was a huge problem. Not getting the guys to play enough games leading into the tournament was a huge concern. We talked about the difference between the Netherlands and Namibia. Namibia played a ton of games leading up into the tournament.
If you look at the Namibian schedule going into that tournament, they must have played like 30, 40 games at home before they even came up.
And they played a bunch of our domestic sides as well. A couple of our domestic sides went up to Namibia, played games there. That's right. So we were talking about the difference, and it was very, very different. And you saw the results because they had the preparation. Okay, just moving forward. So we've got the series on Friday. There were a couple of changes to the Dutch side. You've got Ten Descartes, who's now retired, but he's part of the coaching setup. What other changes do the Dutch have for this particular series?
Well, I guess that depends on whether you're comparing it to the T20 World Cup side or the last time they played ODIs. Dropping out from the T20 World Cup side are, from memory, Logan van Beek and Ben Cooper. The latter especially, although he obviously had a pretty poor T20 World Cup, does sort of weaken the batting, as does the absence, of course, of Ten Descartes, now retired, as you mentioned. And Logan van Beek as well, who was a standout for them, who's been a standout for them in recent years. But this, I think, is kind of an after effect of the pandemic, with players that have family commitments that are based in the Netherlands, as Logan and Ben have been, that have family and such, especially in Australia and New Zealand, that after such a long time away, that I think both of them are back. They're basically out with family commitments. But compared to the last ODIs that they played, which are the only 3 games they've played in the Super League thus far, which was the home series against Ireland, Colin Ackerman comes back in, and Roelof van der Merwe. Those are as I'm sure your listeners will be very familiar with those names. But yeah, that's the Dutch, because it's the Dutch, and more to the point, the English winter, that they have less of a struggle with getting players who have county commitments released. Likewise, another name, Shane Snater, who was a former, another Dutch Zimbabwean in this case, who has some under-19 experience and has been with the Dutch setup for a number of years now. First came over, I think, about 4 years ago to play for a club in Haarlem, and now has been picked up by Essex. And he joins the squad as well.
Yeah, he's a real scoop for you guys, I think. I was obviously watching Essex on the live stream, and really, really impressed with his ability with the ball, swinging it away. I think he because he's got a Zimbabwean connection. I think he might enjoy the South African pitches, the harder pitches. I think he might actually have a good series. Okay, so what are the Dutch looking to get from the series? Obviously, the Proteas are a little bit weakened. They've got quite a few first-team Proteas being rested. Do you think they could win one of the 3 games? Do you think there's a chance there that they could sneak a win if they play to the potential?
I think there certainly is. I mean, to your first question, like, what are the Dutch hoping to get out of this series? That question's become almost moot in the last few days with the discontinuation of the Super League, because while of course the Dutch, they've had a decent start to the series, to the competition rather, and they certainly obviously would have been aiming to start with for direct World Cup qualification. I don't think anyone really thought that was a realistic expectation. So their primary goal in this competition was always to stay off the bottom, to avoid the 13th spot. And now that doesn't matter, because they're going to be relegated by Fiat regardless. In a way, maybe it takes the pressure off them a little bit, because there's actually little other than experience and exposure for them to be gained. But yeah, what are they looking to get out of the Super League at this stage? I guess it's a first and last hurrah at the top level of ODI cricket. Yeah, and in terms of their chances, as you say, there's a lot of players out for South Africa, more than I expected, I have to say. I certainly didn't expect them to play a full strength team, but given that in terms of South Africa's direct qualification to the World Cup, it's far from a done deal. They're looking at a pretty precarious situation given how the Super League's gone for them so far. They've rested a lot of players. And then I think there's been a couple of late injuries and illnesses as well. I think Lazard out late, and Ngidi as well. Now, I think that the Dutch will be looking at this South African team, and certainly it's a strong South African team, and they're at home, which rather negates the traditional strength of the Dutch in their pace attack is formidable at associates level, but if you're bowling South Africans in South Africa, then unlikely to be troubled by pace. But on the other hand, these are a team where you look at them and you think like a lot of these guys are of the standard that we see quite a lot in the Dutch domestic, in the Dutch domestic scene, playing club cricket here. A lot of these guys are on the same teams as the sort of guys that we have over as overseas pros. So I don't think they'll be unduly intimidated, especially given that, of course, a lot of the Dutch team also have a South African domestic experience.
Yes, yes. I was going to get into that about what's happened with the Super League. What does that mean now for the Netherlands? It's obviously a huge hammer blow. We as a Full Quarter Podcast, we're always big proponents of the Super League. We thought it was something worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, not just for the Dutch. I mean, for the Dutch, it's a colossal blow, because they were prioritizing the Super League almost above anything else, even above sort of World Cup qualification and the like, because it's a guaranteed fixture list, which is something that no associate has ever had before. And the extent to which they were gearing not only the team preparation, but also, I mean, the KNCB has undergone an organizational restructure specifically to adapt to the new financial reality of being in the Super League, and to have that ripped out from under them without, there was always a risk of relegation of getting knocked out on the field, but to have it ripped out from under them at a board meeting that they weren't even invited to, I think will be extremely gutting. And I think that in terms of financial ramifications and ramifications for the professionalization of Dutch cricket, I think that the consequences will be significant. But equally for lower ranked associates like Namibia, UAE, Oman are playing in League Two at the same time, and those teams, along with Scotland and Nepal and the like, they were gunning to replace or to join the Dutch in the Super League. That was a major goal for them and a major incentive, and they won't have that shot now. They won't have a chance at that. And even for full member sides, newer full members like Afghanistan and Ireland and Zimbabwe and even South Africa, who have to fight for fixtures against big teams, and especially financially lucrative teams, going back to this model where it's basically horse trading and negotiation among full member sides to decide who plays who. I think that long term the consequences for the game I think they've been severely underestimated. The fact that the ICC has effectively lost this battle to try to impose some kind of structure on the international schedule, I think it's a huge step back for the game.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a huge shock, and I think it's bad for the game. To say, I can't really say anything more. I think it is very, very bad for the game. Cricket continuously tries to shoot itself in the foot for some reason. It has a difficult time trying to grow the game, and then something like this happens. It's not good. Okay, so obviously we are a South African cricket podcast. So there seems to be a very big influence, and there has been for a number of years, of South African players, both domestically in Holland and internationally. I could come up with a whole host of names. Was there something that happened that precipitated that happening? Why is that? Why is there such an influence of South Africans on Dutch cricket as a whole?
Well, I mean, there's long-standing cultural ties between the two countries. You only have to you can look at the Dutch squad and say, oh, there's an awful lot of people born in South Africa. Then you can look at the South African squad and say, there's an awful lot of Dutch names in that squad. Those cultural ties are long-standing, and the family ties as well. People say, well, there's a lot of South Africans in the Dutch squad, and they are South African, of course, and But a lot of them were born to Dutch families in South Africa. So with the exception of, I think, Steph Meiberg and Roelof, I think all the South African players in the Dutch squad were born Dutch citizens, if born in South Africa. But there's been ties, not just cricketing ties, but cultural ties between the two countries. And in terms of cricket, I think it's generally easier. Effectively, for a long time, the same ruling as is the basis in law of Kolpak has also applied in the Netherlands, but without the complications of ruling yourself out internationally. And yeah, then a combination of the fact that a lot of people have family ties, and there's a lot of like established contact especially between franchises in South Africa and the KNCB, and also individual clubs in the Netherlands. The one thing leads to another, and you have one player comes over here, and it's been, there's very few guys that come over here from South Africa and have a poor experience, and often it works as a good base for those who are looking to get into county cricket. So if you look recently, the likes of Heino Kuhn and Graham van Buren and even Faf du Plessis played a season or two here before moving across the North Sea. So it's almost a natural idea to come and play Dutch domestic cricket, especially if you're actually angling to move across the North Sea eventually. But failing that, that, and of course the language is fairly easy to pick up if you already speak Afrikaans.
Indeed, yeah, absolutely. What is the cricket like in the Dutch? Because you've got now a lot of the South Africans there that are there are, shall we say, an older generation. Stefan Meiberg, Roelofs van der Merwes. I know that Brandon Glover just helps the fact with the youngster, because he's a youngster. Are the youngsters coming through? Is there an academy? Is that an area of concern, or do you think that there's enough youngsters coming through if the Dutch can play on a consistent basis?
Well, the Dutch youth system itself has, although perhaps it's been a little better in the last few years, and there are players coming through. The South African connection actually remains, and it's not only South Africa, of course. There's diaspora Dutch populations in Australia and in New Zealand as well, and you see that reflected in Dutch cricket. And a lot of the time, these guys have passports and they come over. So you'll often see sort of South African and Kiwi names cropping up that are a bit younger as well. Brian Klein's coming into the setup now, and his younger brother actually has played under 19s for the Netherlands. The Dutch youth system has underperformed. There's in recent years, you see that their results at under 19 level have been significantly lacking behind what they achieve at the senior level. And I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that you don't have as much of a diaspora influence, and that, simply put, the player pool is small in the European Netherlands. And there's been, I guess, consistent, I think, muddled thinking about how the youth system ought to work here. But there's certainly talent coming through. The difficulty is often that because of the lack of professionalization or professional pathways in the Netherlands for young talented players, you lose a lot of players as they finish school, as they make a choice between pursuing a career in cricket or outside of it. Well, very often a career outside of cricket is simply a better option. And this isn't only a problem for the Netherlands, of course. This is a problem for most associates, is that if you don't have a professional pathway, or a very limited professional pathway, especially one where you see a lot of competition then from overseas passport holders, then cricket is not necessarily the most attractive option either. So you have a lot of this drop off. And then you have, as has been discussed here at length, but I guess is probably less talked about elsewhere, the problem with a lack of ownership of grounds, meaning that you have generally quite poor outfields, fairly difficult wickets, that batting especially is hard and harder to train anyway, but hard to develop in the Netherlands. So you see especially that the Dutch will tend to produce homegrown bowling talent a lot quicker than it will produce homegrown batting talent. And that's why you'll see actually at the top of the order in the Dutch is very often birthplaces outside of the Netherlands. And then when it comes to the bowling attack, that's where you tend to get like young Dutch players who've come up in the Netherlands that get a look in.
Talking about youngsters, I know that you were very complimentary of the current Warriors all-rounder Tristan Stubbs. He had a very good season over there recently. What are your thoughts? Are the Dutch authorities trying to convince him to go the full hog?
Well, I mean, I don't doubt for a moment that they're trying to convince him. Yeah, so Tristan's is Dutch passport holder, so he's dual eligible. He's eligible for both the Netherlands and for South Africa. And he played last season for Excelsior Schiedam, which is one of the well-established top division club here in the Netherlands. And yeah, he did extremely well. In fact, I think he averaged close to 100 from memory, and turned his arm over with a bit of leg spin, and that worked out fairly well for him as well. So he made I do run a small website covering Dutch domestic cricket. Called TK Cricket. For those of you who are interested, he made our team of the year. He was one of the first names on the sheet. I was hugely impressed with him, and he looks like really a player that, especially because the Dutch struggle to produce bats, and because the best performing Dutch batsmen in recent years are all getting on a little bit in years, bar maybe Max O'Dad and Ben Cooper, that he would have been a huge asset to the Dutch. My understanding is that the KNCB were extremely keen for him to turn out for them in the Ireland series, but that there's been some pushback from South Africa, who are essentially, I think there's a feeling in South Africa that so much talent has been lost, sort of to the north, and their experience with Kolpak and so many young talents, going to Europe and not coming back, that the distinction between playing for the Netherlands and taking a Kolpak contract isn't really very clear there, in spite of the fact that really playing for the Netherlands wouldn't affect Stubbs or any young player in that situation. It wouldn't affect their eligibility for South Africa at all, for as long as the Netherlands is an associate. You could play for the Netherlands in one game and play for South Africa the next week. So yeah, and I'm not entirely clear. I did speak to Tristan about it, and he extremely sensibly refused to comment at all. He's a wise young man. He's at least already has the sense not to talk to journalists about this sort of thing. But my understanding is in the chat around the clubs is that there's a degree of pressure in South Africa to not turn out for the Dutch, and my suspicion is that I think probably comes from a bad experience with Kolpak players, and quite possibly actually just not really understanding how eligibility rules work, which, yeah, in my experience, an awful lot of administrators and players don't really understand how ICC eligibility rules work at all.
No, I think you're spot on there. But I do like the fact that they are not necessarily that happy as a whole. We've lost too many players in for the last decade or so. But that is a good point you make, that he could play a one-day international for the Netherlands and next week a one-day international for the Pro Series. That's a good point to make. People should actually know that. Okay. Let's move onto the series. Ryan ten Doeschate has a long career. There'll be certain players that listeners who will have known him. He did play Western Province here before his move over to Essex. Was he convinced? Was he interested in one last fling in playing in his homeland? And also, what about his influence now as a batting? I think Stefan's a batting consultant. So, what is his influence on the whole side?
Well, I've not spoken to Ryan specifically about his series, and I think if there was any if there were any doubts as to whether he was done playing, then the T20 World Cup probably would have resolved them in his mind. He didn't fancy. I mean, it wasn't that he was dropped for the last game. My understanding is that he just felt that the time had come to put a fork in it, so to speak. And I mean, he's a colossal talent, and he's if you look at, I mean, not just the stats, but if you ever watched him play at associate level, it's pretty clear that he's one of the greatest cricketers ever to have turned out for a non-full member, and I think that the fact that he played so much at associate level made people underrate him as an all-time great. Okay, look, his stats were against lower countries, but his stats are extraordinary. So, I mean, he's a huge loss as a playing talent, but the Dutch have had to muddle through without him for most of the games they've played over the last couple of decades. So, his value as a member of the setup, I think, is not to be underestimated. Like all of the younger players in the Netherlands, just absolutely, they'll sing his praises. The effect that he has on the field and in the dressing room is colossal, and he's consummate professional. Are the two words that spring to mind, and that everyone will repeat to you when you talk about Ryan ten Doeschate. I'm not clear entirely exactly what his role is as batting consultant. I suspect that his role is probably broader than that. I know that Ryan sees him as a potential successor in the role of Netherlands head coach. I think the KNTB would be extremely fortunate if they were to secure his services on a permanent basis. But yeah, having him along on the tour, I'm sure is great. Because also it's a fairly young touring side as well, with a few absences. So I think just the opportunity that some of the younger players have to learn from him, the way that he goes about his business and the way that he approaches the game, I think it's a huge influence for them.
Yeah, awesome. No, he's always been I haven't seen or heard a bad word about him. He's as you say, consummate professional. Okay. Any other players that we should watch out for that we perhaps don't know, that we should keep an eye out that might bring a surprise?
Well, I guess the South African contingent your listeners will be fairly familiar with. Your Ackermans and your Van der Merwes, and to a lesser extent your Glovers. I'd say going into the series, the man with the most runs under his belt, the man in form, is Max O'Dowd at the top of the order. Now, how he adjusts the conditions, it's been a while since he's played on anything like a surface or indeed any of the Dutch squad have played on a surface like that in South Africa, is an open question, but he certainly seemed to be in form during the warm-up games. The Dutch have been at Tux playing, I think, an invitational 11. So Max O'Dowd is the man in form. In terms of players that are less well known, I think Clayton Floyd's another Dutchman of South African origin, who's he's come into the team. He didn't make the T20 World Cup squad. He did very well at the European Championships T10 Championships, and is a left-arm spinner who can swing the bat. And then the skipper himself, Peter Selaar, who I think has always been somewhat underestimated as a bowler and has come a long way as a bat as well. It's probably someone that would have flown under the radar a little bit, but is a hugely experienced and very canny left-arm spinner. So I think those are probably the picks. Then the Dutch seam attack, which I think, as I say, it's what's the Dutch success at associate level has been built on with Tim van der Gugten and Shane Snater, Fred Klaassen, Glover now, and Viv Kingma, as well as Paul van Meekeren, who has also opted out of this tour, I think, for personal reasons. But they have this battery of pacers who are of a standard far higher than you'd expect for an associate team. And while I think that will be blunted somewhat by the fact that, broadly speaking, any South African team playing in South Africa is less likely to be troubled by pace. But there, as I say, there's not likely to be as much pump bowled as you'd expect from an associate country playing at this level.
Yeah, but I think you guys, if you can score runs, you might enjoy those pitches. And as you say, we are considerably weaker, particularly in the last 24 hours. Those last guys that are missing is a huge blow. But as you say, also, me and Paul, we would discuss this, and we wanted a young side. We wanted a young, up and coming, inexperienced, give the guys a chance. But as you point out, it's now become moot. But with the Super League that was there, it was very difficult for us to do that where we were. It was very difficult for us to leave out, in theory, Ndidi, Miller, because we needed to win. We needed to win the series. We couldn't let it slide. Any South Africans that you're looking forward to seeing or interested to see? Just before we close out the show, any South Africans interested to see?
Well, yeah, very much. I mean, just to come back on your first point, you're right that this is a series that South Africa really do need to win, more so now than the Dutch do.
Yeah,
and that anything other than a 3-0 scoreline for South Africa is going to put them even further behind the 8 ball, closer behind the 8 ball to get that, I guess, because that's worse in snooker, isn't it? Than they were to start with. And I think if you end up dropping a match here, then you have to start genuinely worrying about whether direct World Cup qualification, then you're in real jeopardy of ending up at the qualifier.
Yeah, which we don't want.
But in terms of players that I'm keen to see that I've not had a chance to see much of before, I think Susana Mcguire is one that I've had to see, but I've heard only good reports about, especially his death bowling. I'd like to see, and Dwayne Pretorius, who of course we know in the Netherlands is one of the many South Africans who have been over here to play some club cricket. I've not seen him play since he last turned out for Dostie Amsterdam, I think. So those two I'd be excited to keep an eye on. But mostly I'm just, now that the series from a Dutch perspective is that there's very little to lose. From a South African perspective, suddenly the pressure is rather on. I'd say I just hope we see an exciting series and some good cricket. If we're going to have cricket without context, then hopefully there'll be enough drama that the series makes some stories worth retelling and makes its own context for us.
Indeed. No, I think it's going to be more competitive than people in South Africa in a way think. I think that's certainly true. Well, thanks very much, Bertus, for coming on. I really appreciate you delving into a lot of topics this evening. But I really appreciate you coming onto the show.
Thanks, Tim. It's an absolute pleasure.
Cheers, mate.